some cultures, that's seen as good luck to break a glass before you start proceedings. Thank you. Namaste, everyone, and such a warm welcome for this book launch. Thank you very much. So as Melissa from JLF was saying, my name is Eric Akoto. I'm here from London. I'm the editor-in-chief and publisher of Litro magazine, which you've all seen here. Shashi and I'm sure Shashi Tharoor needs no introduction, and I will introduce properly later. We collaborated on this edition in October 2016, a way of having an in-look and an in-depth discussion through various writers on India and the Global South. And before I go more into that, I just want to give you a bit of a brief history of what Litro is about. Litro magazine, like Jaipur Festival, has been running for 10 years. The magazine was started in my bedroom in a little shoebox, not like the size of buildings here in India, in Notting Hill. The idea of the magazine is to give a platform for emerging writers such as Abha Iyengar, who joins us, to be celebrated and read alongside literary stalwarts, as Dr. T sat here to my left. The magazine, when I started, had a very small print run, a few hundred, and every month, when we started, it was biannual, and every month I'd pack my rucksack and go knocking on doors around London and ask for people to take the magazines in. We got very lucky, and a few months into the publication, the opening of 2008, the London bookstore Foyles decided to sponsor us. They sponsored us for 4 years. They gave us some money. We were allowed to, and enabled us to increase the print run to 20,000. A couple of years, I'm really speeding along because I've been told book launches last for half an hour, so I'm going to make this very fast. And 2 years later, we were offered by Time Out magazine for Litros to be inserted into their publication. Now, Time Out has 60,000 publications. We then had to quickly find some money so we can do that, and we got very lucky, and we got more sponsors from the likes of UK Trade and Investment, and they supported us, and we were inserted into Time Out magazine. And to cut a long story short, this has been the end result. Litro is now distributed internationally with 60,000 circulation each month. We continue to support emerging writers such as Abha Iyengar. We've had Man Booker listed writers published in a magazine, and now we also have these annual World Series editions. Today, as you're all here and well aware, we're here to launch the Litro Series World India edition. The edition, as I mentioned, was published in October 2016, looking at Global South. Before we proceed, as I mentioned, I was going to give an introduction to Shashi. Shashi Tharoor, as I mentioned, does need no introduction, but I will. No, I will. Shashi, a politician and former diplomat, has published 15 best-selling works, which you're aware of. His monthly column, India Reawakening, appears in 80 newspapers around the world. Abha Iyengar is a freelance writer and poet, and also an engaged activist in Delhi. Before Shashi and I have a conversation about the magazine, how we collaborated, put it together, and the themes we covered, Abha Iyengar will give us a short reading from a story we published called Dragon Slayer in the edition. Abha.
Thank you, Eric, and such a pleasure to be sitting next to you, Shashi. As I have been introduced, I'm Abha Iyengar. I'm a poet, author, essayist, and a flash fiction writer. And it's been my pleasure to be published in a magazine, which is the Litro magazine, which is the India edition, this particular one. And I'll be reading from my story here. It's called The Dragon Slayer. But since we are so short of time, I'll be reading, excerpts from it, and you'll get an idea what the story is about, I hope. So the name of this story is The Dragon Slayer, and it begins like this. Jamie told a story that night to Marie. He talked of a boy named James, and she did not blink. She knew his name was Jamie and that he would have liked to be called James. He had told her once that he was too grown up and should no longer be called Jamie. Marie had agreed. His mother called him Chumar, which was a Hindu name, and he could not understand why. She had embraced Christianity ever since she came to Trinidad Islands on the ship all the way from India. Ma, you are now a Christian. You should give up all thoughts of the old country and its faith, Jamie often told her, but she clung to both with a nostalgia Jamie did not support. She had left his father and come away here with Jamie in her womb and was now working on the sugar plantation, where Jamie worked as well. There was no other choice. They were coolies, cheap Indian labor who worked on the fields for the white masters. That night, he told Marie a story of a boy with blue eyes and straight blonde hair that fell across his forehead so fair that the light could shine through it, and skin that bruised so easy that a red blob formed fresh on the surface almost before the hunter was laid on it. What hunter being laid, she asked, her eyes innocent, but her mind knowing. No hunter lays across such skin, Jamie, you should know it. He told her to listen and not interrupt because it stopped the flow of his words. It also stopped the flow of his dreams where he was this white-skinned James whom Marie would definitely want to get married to at the end of the story. He felt that the real Jamie would never be the man she craved as a partner given his brown skin and black hair that curled unkempt around his ears despite all the oil he put to keep it in place. He watched as she closed her eyes and listened to the rest of his story. She lived next door and they were childhood friends. Jamie had become increasingly conscious of her since the year before. She was a couple of years younger and a fierce protective instinct had developed within him for her. He kept it in check because he felt it would spoil their friendship if she knew his feelings. They spent the hours after work together. She was the one person who lent ear to all his tall tales mocked by their other more boisterous friends. Of course, the younger kids mulled around wide-eyed as they listened to his stories of James the Night Rider. James slayed dragons, he hobnobbed with goblins and fairies at night. He changed his color to a dark-skinned young man to work among the field hands in the morning, to know their world and be one with them so that no one would guess who he really was. But the children grew sleepy and wandered off to their beds, and then there was only Marie. At that time, Jamie's heart swelled with a sweetness he never knew earlier, as he kept on weaving the magic of his story around and around her, so that she would never escape from him. Then Jamie fell sick, and though he went to work, he found that Marie had stopped coming. He sat morose outside his home one evening, waiting for Marie. Maybe he already knew that she would not come. It was late night and the lights had gone off. The street outside the home was deserted. He could not rest and began to walk, his steps moving headlessly, any which way. He was outside Master John's home. He didn't know how he reached there. All he knew was that a light was shining through a window and he was standing in front of him, and he could see two people inside, for the curtains had not been drawn. Master John was holding Marie tight, so tight, that Jamie felt himself choking, as if his throat was being held. Her clothes were off. She was the victim, and he was the dragon. And Jamie was the lonely bystander who watched everything in his misery, unable to do anything at all because he was just Jamie. Not James, never James, the man he wanted to be. He turned and ran, and this time it was not towards home but away into the wilderness. The grass here was thick, and it cut into his arms and his legs, but he did not care. It was a couple of months before he was well. His mother told him that Master John had been kind. He had allowed him to rest. His mother also told him that Mary would be going away. She would come and say goodbye to him before she went. Mary came after 2 days. The evening sun was setting, the sky was bathed in orange light. She looked strange and all grown up, walking with a diffidence he had not seen before. Her steps were short, tentative, and measured, as if she was scared of taking a wrong one. Jamie watched her as if she was a stranger. "How are you, Jamie?" she asked, her voice low. "I am fine, and you?" he said, choking on the words. They both knew how they were. The air filled suddenly with a sweetness that smelled sickly. It smelled of hospitals and births and death. Jamie shook his head and looked at her. There was a slight swelling at her belly that had not been there before. "I saw you that night," he said. "Which night, Jamie?" "That night the hunter was laid against me," he said. Yeah, okay. So just a minute. She knew what he was talking about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Abha. Thank you. If you do, excuse me, want to read the rest of Abha's beautiful story, The Dragon Slayer, there are copies of the magazine in the bookstore, which you can pick up from, or you can read our stories online at litro.co.uk. So now Shashi and I are going to have a quick fire round of questions, because time is fastly going forth. The girls in the corner are nodding their heads. Shashi, within the, and excuse guys if you're not familiar with what we're about to say, but again, you can read all of these online at litro.co.uk. In your editor's letter to the edition, Shashi, you open with the lines, "No other country has anything like it, an annual jamboree of its diaspora conducted with great funfair by its government." Can you talk more about this and how you feel the diaspora and the sort of outgoing of, I guess, intelligentsia of India is being a positive or negative effect?
Thank you, Eric. And just to say that Eric and I, when discussing the special issue you want to bring out, decided early there's no point just having an India issue because lots of people know about Indian writing. But we would take the theme of India and the global south, because India's diaspora in the global south doesn't get a fraction of the attention that, for example, Indians in London or in America are getting with well-known and widely received books. So what I liked about Abha's story was its beautiful evocation of the disempowerment that the Indian coolie in the plantation is feeling when he sees his woman being essentially raped, but with her acquiescence by the master. And the story is really very powerful, and it's also about stories. So I would strongly recommend the story to all of you. I'm sorry Abha didn't have time to read more because it ends very, very beautifully. And in selecting from a rather large collection of entries Eric assembled, I thought Abha's story stood out because when we think of the diaspora, we think about events like the one Eric mentioned, the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, where in January every year, just a couple of weeks ago now, the diaspora, the great and the good and the mighty of the diaspora gather in an Indian city, sometimes with a sort of slightly self-congratulatory air, to be felicitated and celebrated by the Indian government and to have their for the Indian government and the state governments to offer sales pitches for these diaspora people to come in and invest here and so on. But there is also the reality of the coolies, of the indentured laborers, the people who were forced against their will very often to make wholly new lives elsewhere, who have gone on. Now, India has produced a few prime ministers in countries like Trinidad and Tobago, in Guyana, in Mauritius, in, of course, Fiji less successfully because he was overthrown in a coup. But the fact is that you've had now some of the children of these enforced laborers, children and grandchildren rising to positions of prominence. So in some ways, the same kind of people who are being celebrated today in these annual jamborees are the descendants of the kind of people whose plight is so movingly chronicled by Abha in her story. That, in many ways, is the link.
Thank you, Shashi. Again, within your editor's letter, and we're going to touch on the continue about the expatriates and the NRIs, or the non-resident Indians. In your book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, you half-jokingly suggest that the question is whether NRI should stand for the not really Indian or never relinquished Indian. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, in a sense, both exist. You see, many Indians abroad, living abroad, because they have essentially identified themselves with another country, taken its citizenship, acquired its accent, sometimes acquired its names, all of that. They are not really Indian in the way that an Indian growing up in India would be. But at the same time, because of their emotional connect to India, often a sense of loyalty to their origins and their roots, and frankly, the truths told to them by their own mirror, they are also people who have never relinquished India. And you've got both in many ways. And I think, if I remember right, I conclude the essay by suggesting that there is a third explanation for the acronym we can suggest, which is that they are in many ways the national reserve of India. Because living abroad, they've become extremely important to India, sources of support. For example, the Indian American community now has become a hugely influential voice in American politics for relations with India. And I think that's also becoming something that will transform their equation to their homeland.
Thank you, Shashi. And I promise you, all these questions I do know off the top of my head, but because of having to jigsaw and squash everything together, I'm sort of editing, and hopefully these are the best of the questions I had planned for Shashi. I mentioned earlier of the your political activities. Well, I mean, you're a politician in Kerala. I mentioned earlier I'm from London, and I'm from Notting Hill, and once a year we do have 1 million people descend on us, and it's quite chaotic.
Carnival.
Yeah, carnival. And looking here, there's just so many people attending this great festival. But I'm also aware that within the bigger picture, this is very much a small proportion of India's population who are interested in reading, etc. And the UK and Europe, there's government cuts to libraries and books, and it's a very weird time we live in, especially with yesterday's events stateside and that man coming into power. I don't even want to say his name, it just will make me depressed and sad. Anyway, what I want to ask is, are there initiatives that you're pushing in Kerala to encourage reading, to encourage books? Because, I mean, Obama himself said his survival 8 years in the Oval House was from reading, and he was also a short story writer in his earlier life. And of course, you're well aware of the effects of reading and writing. So
India is still good news for books and readers and writers.
Yeah.
The literacy rate's growing up still in every language, and as a result, people are not only more are willing and able to read, but more have increased disposable income to be able to buy books and magazines. So we are now the only media market in the world in which all forms of media are increasing in readership. Newspapers are going up in circulation, magazines are improving in sales, books are being sold in larger number, and the same is true of FM radio, of television channels, which are proliferating and of course the internet. So India is one country where readership is still growing. How long it will continue before we also succumb to the ills of the West, I don't know. But as of now, India is still a good place. And for example, one indication of this is the number of international publishers who have set up stall in India. When I first published a book, which was my book Reasons of State on Indian Foreign Policy, there weren't any. When I published my first novel a few years later, there was one international publisher here, that was Viking Penguin. Today there are at least a dozen, and there are lots of other Indian houses as well, which have come up and which are publishing ever more titles than before. So there's a lot happening in the publishing arena, and I would say the Jaipur Festival's success, to some degree, is part of this wave. It's more people coming. I came here to the second ever JLF at Diggy Palace, and believe me, there weren't even 10% of the crowds we're seeing today. And I suspect that the only thing preventing it from growing even more is the simple physical lack of any more space. It's extremely popular and crowded. All I will say is that books are still of great interest to Indians. And when you say it's only a small percentage of India's population that reads books, the truth is that's true of every country's population. It's only a small percentage of Britain's population, of America's population, that's buying books as well. But at the same time, those who do read care passionately about them here as well.
Well, are there initiatives that, I guess, that you may be doing on the ground in your local constituency, and are there initiatives that you would suggest to central government to be pushing for more readers?
I certainly would be in favor of more campaigns to fund, finance, and stock public libraries. Kerala, my state, has a strong public library movement. Many other parts of India do not, and I think that's a shame because we have a good book borrowing culture in India, and I'd like to see that encouraged and supported with public money. Governments have not been putting much money into reading and into books. In fact, there was a time when government publishers like the Children's Book Trust or the National Book Trust were significant players in the publishing scene, but they've been long since eclipsed, of course, by the private sector. And one could argue maybe the government doesn't need to be in publishing mass market books. Fair enough. But then the resources could be shoveled more and more into helping people who can't afford to buy even a 600 rupee book an opportunity to be able to borrow that book in an accessible library. And my own view, very honestly, is that we need to see much more of that. Kerala has a very strong public reading culture. Pretty much every village has a reading room or a library or both. But very few other states can boast of a similar experience. So if you ask me what's the one thing that the government can do is to put taxpayers' money towards reading and towards supporting the arts.
Thank you for such a good answer there, Shashi. Right, a girl came on stage, I'm sure you saw her, she whispered in my ear, this is the last question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the floor up to the person with the last question.
There's a hand right there.
There's a hand right. Oh, there's two hands.
The young lady, I think, had her hand up first.
Yeah, in the red, yeah, top.
Vanakkam, sir.
Welcome to you.
अगर आपको मौका मिले फिल्मों में काम करने का तो आप कौन सी हीरोइन की अपोजिट काम करना
No,
चाहेंगे?
that's not fair. Come on. Please,
He's
so
smart.
translate.
Actually, I'm his fan.
I know,
I'm
but
a
please.
huge fan of you, sir. इसीलिए मैंने आपको ये सवाल किया
देखिए,
अगर
जब
आपको
तक
मौका मिले
मुझे दो तीन मौके मिले मैं
The
तो
last
मना कर
question
दिया।
has to be that I can understand. Come on.
there's a hand in front.
I'm probably going to get shot for this, so please.
There's a front right. लेकिन मैंने अब तक तो मना किया है. I think there is a gentleman here who want to ask.
पर आपने जवाब नहीं दिया सर.
Because I've been saying no, that's fine.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm an Indian citizen who has lived in Paris for 11 years. I came to India in 2014 to vote in the national elections. My question to you is, while you were living abroad, did you consider yourself non-resident Indian, not really Indian, or National Reserve of India?
No, in my case, my situation was very easy because I was working for the United Nations. So I never had to make that leap of the imagination that emigration involves. I wasn't an immigrant in any of the countries in which I worked. I was an Indian who happened to be serving a world body. But if the next day they had put me in Africa, I wouldn't become African. I wasn't Swiss when I was in Geneva. I wasn't American when I was in New York. I was Indian everywhere. I kept my Indian passport. I spoke of India. I wrote about India. So my situation, however, I was born in London. And therefore, I'm even today entitled to a British passport. I have never exercised that right. I look in the mirror and I see an Indian. And India is the country that I want to work for and write about and care about. Let me, since you mentioned Paris, add one more thing which I think may be relevant to this discussion of the diaspora. When I was first published in French, in translation, I said to my French publishers, why is it that the only Indian writers you're publishing are ones you've read in English? There is this whole Indian literature available in other languages. Once you translate it into French, it doesn't matter whether you translate it from English or from Telugu or Kannada or Bengali or Malayalam. And I suggested to them that they look at the Indian writers in those languages and start publishing translations in French. And I'm very happy to say that in France today, there's a number of publishers who've brought out a lot of, in the last 25 years since I made that suggestion, a lot of very, very good Indian writing is available to the diaspora, which in many ways conveys some of the richness of our culture and our literature. I thought that might also be relevant to the topic of our discussion today. Bienvenue et bonne chance.
Thank you for the final question. What Litro is about is exactly what we're doing today, and sometimes it's chaotic, sometimes it's not chaotic, but it's very much inspiring conversation and using the art of short stories and literature to do so. We are now coming to an end because Melissa's on the stage, and wow, I feel like they're about to attack us and leave us. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Please.